Hey everybody, I'm John Carvalho, president of Stone Oak Capital and Divestopedia. I am so excited for this workshop today. We're going to be talking about acquisition purchase agreements. I've been looking forward to this all week, and I'm sure people that are joining us too are also looking forward to this.
John, that doesn't say much for your other activities.
Hey,
I'm flattered, but
yeah, I am an acquisition nerd. So honestly, having you, Andrew Sherman, here with us today is going to be, just a wealth of knowledge. So Andrew is a partner in the corporate development or corporate department office at Seyfarth Shaw LLP. Andrew is a leading expert in M&A and a prolific thought leader in the transaction space. Andrew, I don't know, how many books have you written on the topic around M&A?
Well, 26 total books and about 6 books that are specific to M&A, business growth, joint ventures, and then the big thick book on due diligence.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And you've been an awesome contributor to Divestopedia, where we kind of first introduced ourselves to each other. So I'm super excited to have you here. Thanks for taking the time out to be talking to us today about acquisition purchase agreements.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love everything that you're doing, and we're going to pack a lot of content into the next hour. And I hope that everybody who's online, we thank you for giving us an hour of your time, and we plan to deliver lots of value.
Yeah, for sure. I know we will. So a couple of housekeeping things. We're probably going to be talking about all of the agenda items that we have. We have lots of things to cover, as Andrew had mentioned. And then, kind of last 15 minutes, depending on how much time we spend on the actual formal agenda, we're going to be taking Q&A. So people, you can throw, and I'm going to be moderating all the Q&A. So please be kind to me. Put in your comments in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to them as many questions as we possibly can. Andrew, before we move on I also want to provide people with your contact information, because this sometimes is lost when we do these workshops, is how do we get a hold of you as the expert that's speaking. So I'm going to throw your email address in our chat box, just so everybody right at the onset has a chance to be able to contact you with questions.
Yeah, three things on that, John, really fast. I mean, number one, in my heart, I'm an educator, and so I'm not here to self-promote our practice or the firm. There's just 3 quick things I'll mention relative to the email address. Number one, most obviously, if I can be of any help to anybody, feel free to contact me. Number 2, we do an annual survey of middle market deal terms, which is a much more granular dive into some of the things we'll be talking about today. The 2020 survey is available, I believe, on our website. And the 2022 deal survey book will be coming out soon. If anybody can't find it on the site or wants a copy of it, feel free to email me. And the third thing is, John and I decided a while back that this would be a dynamic conversation, but like a good lawyer, I have a backup PowerPoint that accompanies some of these thoughts. So if you would like a courtesy copy of the PowerPoint, just email me and I'll get that to you. So, all right, that's as much commercial as you're getting in the next 58 minutes.
Yeah, awesome. Well, okay, you know how excited I was about this, so I want to get right into it. Everyone else excited for this? Let me know in the chat box here. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so Andrew, we talked about kind of that agenda, those agenda items that we wanted to get through, but we'd be remiss if we didn't kind of open up with a really high-level discussion of the key trends that are happening in kind of the purchase acquisition space. So let's talk about that. What are the key trends that you're seeing in the space right now, given everything that's happening in the world today?
I want to disclose one bias, and I'm speaking now to maybe some of the younger lawyers in the profession, and even maybe some of the lazier lawyers in the profession. We cannot, will not draft a purchase agreement in a vacuum. If your idea of an effective purchase agreement is to put on your horse blinders, push a couple of buttons on your computer, and out comes a purchase agreement, I think you're doing yourself and your client a great disservice. We are living in a highly integrated, dynamic, and fluid marketplace, geopolitical marketplace. We've just been through and still going through the greatest pandemic in the history of time. There are so many issues that affect directly or indirectly the purchase agreement that I really think would be a disservice if John and I started out with, okay, here is the purchase agreement. Here's page 1. Here are the parties. What are the issues with the parties? Okay, here's page 2. I would be a tremendous waste of time. Now, we will get into a lot of key issues, but the real thing that I want to dive into first is when I look at the macro world, what are some of the things I'm thinking about as we get into a purchase agreement? And the first one, which I think will come up several times in today's program, is the impact that rep and warranty insurance has had on the purchase agreement. I mean, in the early days of rep and warranty insurance, which was only 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was just the big deals, the upper middle market deals. But there's been a trickle down effect, and you're seeing rep and warranty insurance policies in the lower middle market, and even in some, depending on the situation, small business deals. Now, we do a lot of that work here at the firm, but at the same time, these policies are not perfect, and they have holes in them and they have exceptions in them. And it's very important that if a rep and warranty insurance deal, a policy is going to be in place, that you know how it impacts the purchase agreement, how it impacts issues like allocation of risk that we'll talk about. So that's kind of one big trend. It is not uncommon, even in smaller transactions, that either the purchaser or the seller is going to come up with a request for it. And then remember, when there is a policy in place, there's a whole nother party to satisfy, which is the insurance underwriters due diligence team, who will work together typically with the purchaser's due diligence team and make sure that they're comfortable. So that's point one.
Andrew, quick question. How small of deals have you seen, like rep and warranty insurance on? Like, are we talking?
Smallest deal I've seen so far was in the mid-teens.
Okay.
Total purchase price. And that's pretty small.
Yeah.
I mean, that when we get down into the mid-teens, I mean, we may get to single digits and there's still, a policy. Now, the cost of these policies, the marketplace is getting more competitive. The costs are coming down just a little bit. But remember, if it's a low cost policy, it also might have a lot of exceptions to it. And then how useful is it really? But that's almost a whole standalone, webinar.
Yeah, we do got to do a workshop on that separately.
Exactly.
For sure, to cover that. So, okay.
So that's trend one.
Yep.
Trend two has been the impact of the PPP and EIDL financing. This is a huge issue in the allocation of risk topic. It's a huge issue in the purchase agreement, whether or not the seller has gotten clearance and releases under the PPP or CARES Act or EIDL financing that they've taken. But more importantly, and this is what a critical due diligence issue that's coming up, we're finding that many of the companies that we're looking at from the purchaser's point of view are not as strong as they would otherwise appear when you back out the prop up that the legislation over the last couple of years gave them. Now, look, on the one hand, that was the purpose of the legislation, was to keep small and mid-sized businesses alive during a horrible pandemic. But from a due diligence perspective, if you're on the buy side, deep dive into the company's financials, we're seeing more and more where companies are quite fragile if you back out the infusion of assistance that they got from the government. And as a buyer, now that these programs are wrapping up and sunsetting, you need to be aware of that. And you need to factor that into your diligence and possibly factor it into either purchase agreement or post-closing covenants or post-closing protections. I'm going to go a little fast on these because there's so many of them.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a good, I mean, we have so many people from around the world on this workshop here today. There's been government assistance globally. So that's something that needs to be considered in whatever geographic region that you're in. Is
100%. And by the way, John, to your point, we're not the only country that provided government assistance programs during the pandemic. If you're doing a deal in France or Australia or other parts of the world, get familiar with what government financing that seller may have received during this 2-year-ish period and factor that into the financial due diligence.
Yeah. Just quickly, we have so many people asking in our Q&A here for the presentation. We'll send out the presentation to everybody. So we'll definitely send it out to everybody.
Well, as long as you ask fair and reasonable questions. If you ask me a zinger, we're taking you off the list. I'm just kidding. You can ask zingers.
Okay.
No extra charge. All right, third big trend. This one is its own webinar probably as well. ESG, environmental social governance. ESG is not just stuff for the Fortune 500 anymore. There are a lot of larger buyers that are doing ESG specific due diligence, ESG specific reps and warranties. They cannot afford, in a public image in a social media driven environment, to buy into a company that's been discriminating against people, that's been polluting rivers. They're spending millions of dollars propping up their ESG principles and commitment, and advertising even on the Super Bowl, talking about their commitment to sustainability and the environment. And if you're on the sell side and you are not ESG compliant in some way, do not be surprised to see ESG reps and warranties creeping their way into the purchase agreement, and ESG due diligence questions, which is, of course, where the reps and warranties come from. I mean, one critical point, we can get into this maybe in a few minutes, but purchase agreements don't just arrive from the sky. There's a process. The process begins with the letter of intent. The letter of intent is the roadmap to getting the purchase agreement drafting properly. Then there's a due diligence process, which should be shaping the reps and warranties and specific covenants in the purchase agreement. And then the purchase agreement gets drafted. Anybody trying to skip that process is, again, doing the deal and their client a disservice. So ESG is relevant as a macro trend that's not going away anytime soon. And you're going to see them more and more creeping into acquisition agreements. Fourth, post-COVID health, safety, workplace compliance. Understand that we have just been through the worst pandemic in the history of mankind. What has not yet really been litigated in the courts is who's responsible. I mean, millions and millions of people died, and it's still too soon to figure out who to hold accountable. Nobody wants to wake up one morning and realize that health and safety or OSHA standards or failure to comply with local regulations might have caused the death of one or more of the employees of the seller, and now it's the buyer's problem. So we have this huge cloud of not knowing what liability will look like from a compliance perspective, from a government fines perspective, from a wrongful death perspective, employee liability and workplace liability. That is hanging over every transaction. And so when it comes to the purchase agreement, don't be surprised to see more indemnification, larger holdbacks, until we get a handle as a legal community on what this will look like, right? No, Linda, there are no slides. We're just having a conversation. The slide deck, I didn't mean to confuse anybody, is something I prepared before John and I coordinated that we would just be having a conversation. It's a gift from me to all of you as attendees if you want it. Okay, fifth trend. We cannot put rising inflation, the great resignation, the cost of capital, rising interest rates in a vacuum. These macro and microeconomic variables will find their way into the purchase agreement. Let's take one as an example, the great resignation. 16 million people resigned from their jobs between July and October of last year. The trend's slightly slowing down, but not a lot. So here you are as a buyer doing due diligence on the human capital, the most important asset of the seller, and you're realizing that half the people that were listed on their employee list resigned in the last 6 months, and their org chart looks like a slice of Swiss cheese. What are you buying? I mean, we're in a knowledge-based service economy, and people are everything, and we've got a higher level of resignations and people becoming free agents and independent contractors. And you've got to understand, I mean, any purchase agreement I'd be working on would have reps and warranties around, where did these people go? Did they have any claims, residual claims? Are they now 1099s? Do they meet the 1099 test under California's AB5? I mean, there's all this human capital stuff that's new and different than the gobs and gobs of labor employment regulations that we already had to have reps and warranties around and covenants around in the past. The geopolitical risk is very real. You know, we spent 10 years encouraging small and mid-sized businesses to be global businesses, to participate in the global village, to export goods and services all over the world. And now we're in an environment between China and Russia. You know, I was saying to somebody, I miss BRIC. I miss the days when BRIC stood for 4 countries that we were very bullish and big trading partners around.
Yeah.
I mean, all of a sudden, 2 or more of these countries were not in such great shape with. So the geopolitical volatility, how these things may directly or indirectly affect the value proposition of the transaction, needs to ultimately find its way into the purchase agreement. I can't tell you less than 24 hours into Russia's invasion into the Ukraine exactly how that will manifest itself. All I can do on this webinar is ask you to think about it. Don't have the horse blinders on and say, oh, things that happen on CNN don't affect my draft. They absolutely do. And certainly the things that happen on Bloomberg and CNBC are going to affect your draft. And that's why people tune into webinars like this, so that there's both timeless information, but also things that are ripped from the headlines as recently as 6 o'clock this morning.
And I think kind of an overview of that is like mitigation of risk, right? Like how do you capture, you know, not only the micro, as you mentioned, but also the macro risk elements that are out there? How do you mitigate that? How do you communicate that in a purchase agreement? And how do you, you know, find some recourse if that risk comes to bear?
100%. And you know, maybe I'm just getting old and crotchety, but you know, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I get very worried that we're living in a world where it's so much easier to, you know, press a couple of buttons on our computer and use an AI program to generate a purchase agreement, and it's going to be okay. You know, but okay is not good enough. You know, you can produce an okay purchase agreement with a few computer strokes, but I think you're on a webinar like this because you want to be the best. You want to have the best purchase agreements, the best due diligence, the best practices. You want to be the best investment banker or intermediary or industry advisor or best CPA in your region on M&A. And to be the best, we've got to look beyond the 4 corners of the agreement.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll take on that debate with anybody and everybody that wants to challenge me on that one.
Okay, so what number are we on here for the trends?
Yeah, I know, because we're getting I see it in your face, John. We're getting to 120. Let's go just quickly. Number 6, we've talked a little bit about supply chain and labor shortages, geopolitical conditions. But for example, you know, the more volatile the world gets, the smaller the stomach for risk of a buyer becomes. The smaller the stomach for risk of a buyer becomes begins directly affecting deal terms, earnouts, contingent consideration. When we remember, what markets hate is look into the crystal ball and see only fog. If they see fog, it eventually finds its way into the purchase agreement, because risk is like that old children's game of hot potato. And if you're a buyer in a volatile environment and you don't know what this business is going to do into the future, you're going to try and make sure that the ball is in some other kid's lap when the teacher blows the whistle. If any of you remember the game hot potato that I played in nursery school. Last couple of ones, we'll get into these. I know one of them we'll get into towards the end of the program. Challenges in post-closing integration leading to more post-closing disputes are pervasive, and we can talk about that in a few minutes. Last 2 trends. One is cross-border deals. Do you know, for almost 2 years, people wanted to do a lot of cross-border deals, but between COVID restrictions, travel restrictions, immigration restrictions, they were having trouble doing business cross-border. When will that come back? Purchase agreements cross-border are very different than domestic-only purchase agreements. Choice of law issues, where to resolve disputes, how to resolve disputes, different regulatory considerations, antitrust considerations, all those things have to be factored in. And if you've gotten a little lazy on your cross-border drafting, get ready for it to come back, I think, by this fall, depending on geopolitical risk because of COVID, hopefully finally amping down. Last but not least, all of us in the M&A world, including John and I, have not been sleeping much. It has been a very intense 18 months. I mean, very intense. And it's been hard on us as people. I'm not trying to get violins played right here, but many M&A lawyers I know and M&A advisors are a little bit tired because it's been a very intense 18 months. I don't know when the breather's coming. Is the breather coming later in the year? You know, there will be a pause because the M&A process is like going to the salad bar and filling up your plate this high and eating it all. At some point, companies, buyers need to digest their food and, you know, make a couple of visits to you know where before they're ready to digest again. We as humans can't eat nonstop without it eventually being a problem, and buyers can't acquire nonstop before they give themselves time to digest. The problem is that there's still a lot of unallocated capital in the private equity and corporate treasuries, and there's pressure on those companies from their stakeholders to do more acquisitions. And so I don't know when it comes to an end. You know, if you're tired, stay tired, because it could be busy throughout this year and even into 2023, even with all the macroeconomic and geopolitical and capital market volatility and risk that we've talked about. Okay, that was a long diatribe.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, you're right. I mean, you know, people that are serial acquirers, they think that, you know, they might have kind of a cookie cutter approach to doing acquisitions. You know, you need to reflect on each and every acquisition on the risks that are relevant. And then, you know, to Andrew's point, you can't just use, you know, a templated purchase and sale agreement that you've used on other agreements. You need to consider the dynamics and the changing environment of what's happening in the marketplace. So, you know, great points, great overview, Andrew. Appreciate that.
You know, another just quick observation I'd make is one of the other things that's driving these trends is I call it acquisitions that affect other acquisitions. So on one deal we're working on now, without naming any names, two manufacturers have consolidated. That's caused some suggested consolidation in the distribution networks. And now there's merger and acquisition activities buying among some of the distributors. And so how do all those things align and what customization needs to be in the purchase agreement is all very, very relevant.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome.
All right.
So let's get into, we talked about not getting into boilerplate issues, but let's get into the boilerplate issues now. Cause I think, you know, I really like to, you know, I like to get into the specifics. I like to drive and try to deliver to our audience, you know, real, you know, granular advice on this, which I think is lacking in the marketplace. So, and Andrew, you're the perfect guy, obviously, to bring this to us. So our first agenda item is just talking about purchase of assets versus sales. Is that even an issue anymore? Like, do
you know,
people even
from a
think
tax
about,
perspective,
like,
I mean, you can elect to have the stepped up basis. And so the one thing I will not bore any of you with in the 37 minutes we have left is too much on tax. Number one, I'm not a tax lawyer. And number two, I don't want to put anybody to sleep. If you had a big lunch, I start talking about taxes, you start dozing off. I won't do that. But it is very relevant from a risk management perspective. It's not as much a tax issue as it was before, but certainly from a risk management perspective and also from an asset preservation perspective. So let me explain the two examples. From a risk management perspective, if I come into a company and my early stage due diligence is like, man, and I'm picking on John here, this is not an actual thing, but John runs a sloppy shop, sloppy accounting, sloppy internal controls. His HR director left 3 years ago. His people are a mess. There's all kinds of claims that are floating out there. I don't want to step into that risk by doing a stock purchase agreement. I want to pull back and say, you know what, John, you've run a sloppy shop for 3 years. I know you would prefer a stock purchase agreement, but we're going to come in with an asset purchase agreement because there's a little bit more liability protection, not perfect liability protection, but a little bit more liability protection if we do an asset deal. But there are successor liability issues And there are claims that people may make coming out of the woodwork who don't care whether it was an asset or stock purchase. It's a relevant variable if you're trying to defend yourself against a post-closing claim. And then, of course, we've got the rep and warranty insurance and everything else. In a stock purchase, you have to ask yourself, is there some very valuable franchise or legal right or government contract that we want to preserve the continuity of and to have the change in control as seamless as possible? And so there are times when a stock purchase agreement makes a lot more sense from an asset preservation perspective. It's typically intangible asset, a relationship asset, a state franchise asset, a government grant or a government contract asset that the parties are trying to preserve.
That's a really important point that I've seen on the acquisitions. It's just so like a stock purchase is so much smoother from an operational perspective. But you make a really good and great distinction around, if there's just so much risk on the acquisition that you can't kind of avoid it, and you're just taking on too much through a stock purchase. The asset purchase might be a little bit more of a requirement.
Now, here's another aspect of asset versus stock. There's a concept known as cherry picking. John may have a business that has 3 or 4 components to it, and he's never separated out those components from a parent subsidiary perspective. And at this point, he's not as inclined to do so in my hypothetical. So I come into John and I say, look, I'm not interested in your publishing business. I'm not interested in your webinar business. I just want the advisory side of your business. So what I'm doing is I'm cherry picking certain assets that John wants, that I want to buy from John. John's going to continue these other businesses under his corporation. And that might be a set of facts where so many of us are doing so many different things that if not all of the activities or not all of the assets are of interest to you, then a stock purchase agreement wouldn't make sense. It's particularly the case if they've got real estate in the entity and the real estate hasn't been carved out. Most companies have carved their real estate into a separate subsidiary or holding company, but not always. And so some of it, again, is very fact specific. But given the amount of many other issues we have to get to, we probably want to jump to the next topic.
Yeah, for sure. And I do have a lot more questions on the purchase and assets and sales, but let's talk about the next one. So, I want to chat to you about kind of the form and timing of payment of the consideration. So maybe you can give a quick recap of the type of consideration that an acquirer,
Sure.
Would consider when they're buying a business. And then we can, dig deeper into the typical terms, maybe not typical terms, but more market terms of those different types of considerations.
All right. So the obvious, easiest one to understand is cash, right? You're going to show up at the closing table with a suitcase full of cash, unmarked bills. Nobody does that anymore. It's all electronic transfer. But cash is cash. There's not much to talk about. It's a wonderful asset to have. I haven't seen yet, but I'm sure I will. People wanting to get paid in crypto. I'm sure that's coming in the M&A world and may already be parts of deals. You're seeing it in athlete compensation and that type of thing. The second would be when the buyer is trying to allocate some risk to the seller through the purchase price terms. Now, there's a lot of other ways to allocate risk throughout the document, but now I'm trying to allocate risk through the purchase price terms. What are some of the ways that I can do that? One would be to say, hey, seller, I'm going to pay you half the money now. Let's make the net math easy. It's a $20 million deal. I'm going to pay 10 of it in cash, and I'm going to give you a promissory note for $10 million. And that promissory note is paid over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. That type of seller financing is not uncommon. It usually gets negotiated over interest rate and payment terms. But the minute you're not getting paid in cash, you need to open up a concept that could be another interesting webinar topic called reverse due diligence. Well, what is reverse due diligence? It's when the seller is doing due diligence on the buyer. Why? Because now I'm going to be holding paper that is issued by the buyer. Well, I need to know what financial condition, all these questions that the buyer's asking me as seller, I may need to ask back now to know what the value of that paper is,
Yeah.
and
What's
under,
typically reasonable there? What could a seller ask for from a buyer that you see as like not overstepping, I guess?
business plans, strategic plans, how leveraged is the company, from a financial statements perspective? Have they done 8 deals this year and issued paper for 50% of the purchase price to all of them? What's the risk of default? How subordinated will my piece, my promissory note be relative to their commercial financing? There's a lot of questions that are not beyond the realm of unreasonableness if I'm taking paper back. And
Yeah.
I'll make a related point on this in a second, where I'll just say, see our last 5 minutes of conversation. The other two types that are most common would be deferred consideration, such as the promissory note, but also there's a big trend right now, even among private equity acquisitions, for what's called rollover equity. Now, what's rollover equity? Rollover equity is, I'm going to buy not 100% of John's company. I'm going to buy 80% of John's company, and John's going to roll the remaining 20% into the buyer co. Well, John's getting a nice check for his 80%, but now 20% of his return on the sale of his company is tied up in my performance as buyer co. And John may have a few questions for me about buyer co's plans and financial conditions, and what are my expectations of John on a post-closing basis, because 20% is not a small number. Now, if it's 2 or 3% rollover equity, most people are like, yeah, I hope it's worth something one day. But what you're seeing both as a risk mitigation technique, but also if I'm expecting John to stick around and work for the company, which we'll talk about in terms of post-closing responsibilities, I may want John to still have some skin in the game. And there's nothing like having 20, 25% of your purchase price in rollover equity to ensure that John has skin in the game. And that's before we even get into the E word, earnouts. This is just deferred consideration, seller financing, rollover equity. These are all very common. And remember, for every dollar that the purchaser is getting you to accept your consideration in these forms is $1 less of borrowing the purchaser needs to make, $1 more that he's got available to do other acquisitions. So you may think that the buyer is being kind of persnickety on this stuff, but for some buyers, particularly private equity buyers, it's all math. Yeah. And if they can get you to take more and more risk in the articulation of the purchase price, they're going to do it. Whether they're strategic or financial buyers.
Quick question. How common is it for corporate acquirers to use kind of that rollover equity strategy? Especially if, in the public markets, it might be a little bit easier because there's transparency and there's liquidity to those shares. But in the private market.
But there may be lockups.
Yeah.
Just FYI, just because you're getting bought by Procter & Gamble and the shares are trading in the thousands of shares every few seconds, doesn't mean that you can sell yours right away. Beware of lockup clauses.
Okay, so for sure. And then as an acquirer, so are private companies using kind of that rollover equity strategy?
Well, here's your lawyer answer. It depends. If these companies are roll-ups, remember the roll-up strategy, they probably are trying to get the sellers to take as much equity back as they can, because that's the sale of the vision. In the last 18 months, we've had this amazing infusion of SPACs, special purpose acquisition corporations, where the consideration to the seller is very complicated, in terms of when does the seller actually realize the money that has been promised to them if a SPAC is your acquirer. And remember, with all the SPAC activity and all the SPAC stock pullback, which has been very volatile, there's still, I think, 400 SPACs that have yet to find a dance partner, and they don't have an unlimited time period to find that dance partner, and time is running out on them. But for big public buyers, they have so much cash that they're probably not going to be as inclined as a smaller public company buyer or a private company buyer or someone that is, uh, doing a roll-up strategy. I'm
Yeah,
seeing a lot of earnout questions pop up, so I think we better get to earnouts
let's
because
do it.
that's
Let's do
the
it.
last subtopic of your form and timing of payment and consideration.
Yeah, let's
So
do it.
first, just in case there's any participants that don't know what an earnout is, let me explain it very, very, very briefly. An earnout is a form of consideration, but what it's saying to John, let's just say hypothetically, I'm buying John's company. I think John's company is worth 18 million and he thinks it's worth 22. Maybe we negotiate and settle on 20, but John digs his heels in and says, my company is worth 22. And I dig my heels in and I say, no, John, I think it's worth 18. So then I turn to John and I say, okay. You think it's worth 22, prove it. Let's come up with a formula. Sometimes the formulas are easy to understand. Sometimes they're barely English. That's going to say, if John's right, and on a post-closing basis, the company performs, maybe he is worth 22 million. Frank, maybe he's worth 23 or 24, 25 million if we're going to get creative. But there will be a series of contingent considerations, which if not met, John's getting $18 million for his company. These earnouts are a form of contingent consideration. They are being used more commonly to bridge gaps in negotiated valuation, but they're also being used to reduce the risk of the buyer. Now, this program today is oriented towards buyers. If you're a seller, you want to have as much certainty in the earnout as you can. And if you're going to be John, you think your company's worth 22 million, then at least get the right to try and earn 23 or 24, make it, have some upside for everybody. But on the buyer side, which is the focus of today's program, these are all tools in your toolkit to reduce risk and to close gaps in negotiation over valuation.
Yeah, and earnout, another topic that I need to take a list, but another topic that deserves its own separate,
We
webinar.
could talk for hours. I mean, we've been involved in earnouts that have gone very, very smoothly, and we've been involved in earnouts that have gone not so well. I would throw out an alarming statistic that I saw recently from a middle market survey that about 60% or more of earnouts wind up in dispute, and about the same amount of earnouts are never earned or only partially earned. So, if you are on the sell side, think of it as like the icing in the cake. Make sure that your core consideration, the cake portion, is adequate for your own retirement needs and financial comfort and other things, and really try and think of the earnout or other contingent consideration as being the icing.
Yeah, and just kind of finalizing that topic so we can move on. But I've always found that simpler is way better. I mean, you talked about how these calculations can be super convoluted, but the easier, the less complex, the better.
Agreed. But some businesses, if you're in complex government contracts, for example, there's almost no way to make those things simple.
Yeah.
But totally agree. Simpler is better. Throughout the purchase agreement, anytime it's taking you 3 to 4 pages to explain something, it's probably not a good thing as a general matter.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so this is going to be a big topic that we're going to talk about right now: issues to consider in reps and warranties. And I'm just going to put an article that you and I. This might be our first article that you and I ever worked on together on Divestopedia. But you have
we should make an NFT out of it, and we could sell it for a couple $1 million. I mean, please don't just give it away. Let's NFT it.
Let me think about that. But
okay.
You have like just an
I'll sign it. I'll whatever it takes.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like we might have something there. But you have this uncanny ability to make the complicated really kind of simple. We talked about simplifying stuff. And in this article, which I'm going to put in the chat here, you have you've just been able to kind of summarize the different levels of representations that people can give within purchase agreements. Could you just give us a high level of those representations? There's I'll let you speak to it.
Sure. To me, there's two or three types. I mean, look, there's broad-based reps and warranties that need to be in every purchase agreement, no matter what the structure, no matter what the industry. Is the seller selling these shares, if it's a stock purchase agreement, free and clear of any claims? I mean, I couldn't even imagine an agreement that didn't have that basic rep and warranty. But where it gets granular and where the real expertise comes in is we, the lawyers, are supposed to be working with the other subject matter experts, the IT people, the HR people, the risk management people, the CPAs, and be gathering data and saying, what are the true inherent business risks that we're trying to protect against? And the rep and warranty is the sword and the shield that is protecting the buyer. And that's even before we get to rep and warranty insurance. Let's just talk about an insurance-free deal to keep it simple for a second. You are trying to customize the reps and warranties, not to create hundreds of pages of undue stuff, but you're forcing disclosure. Every rep and warranty is around a particular area of risk that you are forcing disclosure. Because if you take a rep and warranty that says, there are no employee claims in against us as of the date of closing. Well, first of all, no means no. I mean, no means zero, right? So there are no current employee claims. Okay, John, the CEO of the company, is reading it and he goes, well, actually, there's one open claim now. Okay, let's schedule it. The schedules are often looked at as some mechanical thing that a paralegal does in the back room. No, the schedules force disclosure, force a dialogue. Oh, okay, John, I see you've scheduled in the second draft of the purchase agreement an open employee claim. Hey, can we talk about that a little bit? Like, what's going on? Do you think it's going to be settled before closing? What's the nature of the claim? Was that claim part of a bunch of other claims that came up in the past? Is there a cultural, hole in your company? I mean, please don't look at these things as just legal boilerplate. Look at them as an investigation. Where's Waldo? A puzzle that you're trying to solve. And think about the company. Every deal on the buy side is supposed to start with a clear economic value proposition. I'm buying this company from John for $20 million, not because I think it's worth $20 million, but because one day I think it's going to be worth 30 or 40 or $50 million. I have to use the reps and warranties to test and retest again this value proposition. When
Okay,
you
that's
see
awesome.
Deals, sorry, John, go ahead.
No problem. I'm gonna. This is awesome information, but I do want to get through each piece. I do want to just.
I could go for 4 hours on this stuff, and I would
Awesome.
if I could.
I always hate being rude and interrupting, but one quick question. From the acquirers, you made such a great point that you need to integrate kind of the rep and warranty disclosure with due diligence. Sometimes I see buyers use the rep and warranties in lieu of due diligence, right? Where they try to throw everything in the purchase agreement, and I think it's overwhelming on the other side. What's the balance between that?
Yeah, I mean, look, two things, and you can call me old school, you can yell at me if you want. Online data rooms are a wonderful invention, particularly during the pandemic. But online data rooms then become a substitute for the face-to-face due diligence. And some things are better covered over a conference room in person. If I'm asking John a question and he starts squirming and sweating, I want to see that. I don't want to just find it in a data room. So it's both. Now, rep and warranty insurance is having the same effect on reps and warranties. It's like, I don't want us as practitioners, as M&A advisors, as M&A thought leaders, to get sloppy in our due diligence just because online due diligence rooms exist. And I don't want us to get sloppy on our reps and warranties just because rep and warranty insurance exists. And now we have drafting.
Sorry, I would add just the acquirer themselves too, right? Just to kind of hand this off and let the purchase agreements kind of run the show in terms of mitigating all risk.
And by the way, it's becoming more and more clear to sophisticated acquirers that brand and culture and people and relationships and processes are the true assets that are being bought. These are the assets of today's M&A deal. And I submit to you philosophically, It is very hard to get your arms around a company's true brand and culture and governance and leadership and engagement of people in an online due diligence room and getting lazy and kicking back and relying on a rep and warranty insurance policy. That's not what they're there for.
Yeah.
They're there to be belt and suspenders. Belt is a due diligence data room and a rep and warranty policy. Suspenders is getting on an airplane and visiting the company,
Okay.
and please be that belt and suspenders buyer.
Awesome. And this is a good lead into our next kind of conversation with negotiation tactics. So, like everybody always talks about getting the legal representation on early, even before the LOI process. But
Please,
a
please
lot of times,
don't bring me in after the LOI is signed. Please don't.
yeah,
I beg you.
yeah, and so tell me how you handle negotiations. Like when you're putting
Okay.
together a purchase agreement, do you make it who drafts a purchase agreement? Is it typically the buyer or the seller?
Typically
And
the buyer's counsel,
okay,
unless it's a really competitive auction and the seller knows it's going to have like 30 companies bidding on it. Sometimes the seller's counsel will draft a purchase agreement because it's got negotiating leverage and it
yeah,
knows that it's not going to leave the dance without a dance partner or two. So, but most of the time, the purchaser's counsel is drafting the purchase agreement.
yeah, and I guess to your point, the person that kind of drafts the agreement kind of has the upper hand of what's initially included in there, and then the points that are negotiated. So how do you?
What did we learn from this year's Super Bowl? I'm getting to your question and finish your sentence for you because we've got 15 minutes left. So we're both now, John and I are just in psychic sync here.
Yeah, for sure.
What do we learn from this year's Super Bowl? There's one job on the football field that's more important than every other job. What is it?
I would say the quarterback, but
The quarterback.
yeah.
I was setting you up for that. And now we're in a scramble where every team, including my team here in Washington, is searching for a quarterback with experience and a quarterback that in his first year with the team, first year, can win a Super Bowl. Same thing in M&A deals. There's going to be all these advisors on the buy side and the sell side. There's going to be advisors on the sources of third-party financing side. Now there's a whole set of advisors on the rep and warranty insurance side. We need quarterbacks, or it is one huge mess. When it affects the purchase agreement, it's like this. The investment bankers are talking to the investment bankers. The accountants are talking to the accountants. The deal advisors and subject matter experts are talking to each other. The lawyers are talking to each other, but nobody's quarterbacking the two sides. So when it comes to negotiating the purchase agreement, first decide who's the quarterback for the buyer, who's the quarterback for the seller. They will coordinate with the quarterbacks for the third-party financing, the quarterback for the rep and warranty insurance policy issuer. But what I see in deals sometimes is there's flaws in the purchase agreement because the quarterbacks are not coordinating. So the client needs to decide who's going to quarterback this deal. Now, many investment bankers believe that they are the better quarterback because they have that holistic feel of business and finance and strategy. Sometimes, yes. But if your lawyer has those same skill sets, which, I'd like to think I have, maybe the lawyer should be the quarterback. But the point is there should be a quarterback. So to your point, if it's a legal technical point, it's always lawyer to lawyer. But someone needs to be quarterbacking the whole the whole spectrum of the open issues, and they need to be communicating. If the accountants just worked out a compromise on a particular accounting issue, someone needs to tell me and my team so that we can then make that change in the accounting section of the reps and warranties. And many deals are more disjointed than you think, and the pandemic didn't help because now we have deal teams that aren't communicating with each other and deal teams that aren't communicating internally because this one's working from her home in Potomac and another one's across the river, and they're the collaboration in the hallways and at the water cooler has not been happening the last 2 years. So
I think that's an important point. And truthfully,
so,
I didn't know where you're going with your analogy.
It's bigger
but
than just negotiation.
One.
It's negotiation and communication. And of course, communication is a critical piece of negotiation. But there's a lot of techniques used. I know you had a question about techniques. bridging the gap, horse trading, your big issue for my big issue. I would tell you the most important point about negotiation is understand what's really driving the parties. We had an issue. We were having a lot of trouble closing a transaction recently, and we finally peeled the onion back and back and back. And what was really bothering the seller was that they had an office building that was being conveyed to the buyer, and the office building was bought by the grandfather, 80 years ago,
Yeah.
and it had his name on the top of the building. And do you know they never disclosed to us till the very end that one of the big things they were worried about was the building name being changed. When we finally figured that out, as small as that issue was, it wasn't small to them.
Yeah.
And we as buyer of the building said, you know what, for the next 5 years, we will not touch that sign. Even though we now own the company, it's still going to be the blah, blah, blah building. And I can't tell you, John, how much comfort that gave the seller.
Mhm.
When you're negotiating, don't just be this jerk that just wants to win every point. Look at where the areas of compromise might be and try and unpeel the onion far enough to know what's really driving the party. It's not just BATNA and all that kind of stuff. It's understanding businesses are bought and sold by people. People have people issues, and if you can get to that, you can negotiate more effectively, I believe.
That's a great point. And just so adding to this really quickly, I think the idea and concept of going to market with a team, of advisors, right? Where, the lawyer, the
Laurie
the
Morrison,
accountant.
emotional intelligence.
Yeah, every
100%. Sorry, John. Now I interrupted you.
no worries, no worries. But where everybody is on the same page and they understand what the objectives of the deal are, I think that facilitates the deal a lot better. And then to your point, on the flip side, really understanding the objectives of the seller, I think will help in kind of finding that compromise and that balance. I'm going to put you had another great article on Divestopedia that we'll create an NFT around, but you just talked about, all really when you're negotiating the purchase and sale agreement, it comes down to kind of three buckets. It's the allocation of risk, which we talked a lot about. It's price and terms. So this is, again, specific to the purchase agreement. It's like the price and terms.
You're going
That's
to
in
be
your
getting
presentation?
this slide in the slide deck. I don't know if you can see it or not. Don't worry about it. But this is exactly what John's talking about.
Okay, and then the third is mechanics and logistics. So,
Exactly.
how do you try to manage kind of the downside in all of those real quickly?
Yeah, those buckets came from a speech I had to give in Denver years ago, where somebody raised their hand and said, Attorney Sherman, the document's 90 pages long. Can you summarize it in a sentence? And I was like, wow, most lawyers would get pretty freaked out by that. And I finally just got a whiteboard and I said, okay, everything basically in this 90-page plus document falls into 3 or 4 categories. First job is to know which category it's in. Is it a consideration issue? Is it an allocation of risk issue? Yes, I can draft a 11-page indemnification clause as effectively as any of the lawyers on the other side of the table. But what am I trying to accomplish with the 11-page indemnification clause? And what are the circumstances that truly might come up as an indemnification matter? And so, since we're running short on time, one easy tool, and I'm sorry to do this, John, that will also be in the PowerPoint, just this one slide. I just want to explain it because it's really important. When we get to balancing risk protection and getting deals done, the point I want to make, because we have limited time left, is not every due diligence surprise should be treated the same, okay? Due diligence surprises come in one of 4 categories that are driven by either risk or cost, because these are your 2 questions and what you sent me are closely related to each other. That's why I'm combining them. And what you need to say to yourself is, for every due diligence surprise, is it such a big surprise that I walk away? Why would you walk away? Well, either the risk is too big or the value proposition of the transaction has been destroyed, right? I mean, you don't move forward. If it's just an economic issue, to John's point about purchase price, then we're going to have to retrade the economic terms. But if it's a legal risk issue, we need to not retrade price, but maybe we need to beef up the reps and warranties. We need to beef up the holdback. We need to beef up the indemnity clause. We need to beef up the things that are going to protect the buyer from the risks that have been assumed. And then, quite frankly, there may be certain, due diligence surprises that we just ignore because they're really not worth talking about. And it does frustrate me when I'm on the sell side, when buyer counsel will nitpick every due diligence surprise, even when they're an easy fix or really de minimis economic or legal risk.
Yeah. And I think, one thing I try to do with my clients is really try to help them, assess the level of the risk. Everything could be a potential risk, but what's the probability of that risk actually occurring?
Exactly. And one thing that we've lost a little bit in the last few years is we've lost our perspective. We have a lot of people making mountains out of molehills, and that's not helping. We're trying to get more deals closed and less disputes afterwards, which is your segue to post-closing disputes. Then we really need to be selective in our problem solving, selective in our problem identification, and really think through how does this affect the value proposition of the deal if I'm on the buy side, and what post-closing challenges will it raise for me, and what are the real costs of those challenges?
Yeah. Can we do post-closing dispute resolution
Yes.
in like 2 minutes, and then we take one or two questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Here's the bad news, and I hate ending on bad news. We are still doing a bad job as a country and as a world on post-closing integration. Every big, from Deloitte to McKinsey to you name it, is publishing data that 60-70% of M&A deals fail to meet all of their pre-closing objectives. That is not a good track record. Post-closing disputes are on the rise. Post-closing integration remains challenging. There are things that can be done by lawyers and advisors to mitigate that risk. I think our due diligence skills have gotten a little soft. We need to increase the intensity and the breadth of due diligence. We need to be more strategic in our thinking. We can't resolve everything with just 40 pages of post-closing, covenants and post-closing conditions. And nobody's going to want to sell their company if 80% of the purchase price could be repaid, will be held back, or 80% of the purchase price they're still liable for 5 years later. Like, why would you bother selling? Yeah. So we're going to have to find a compromise, but we're going to have to continue, and this is the mission, I believe, of Divestopia in part, continue to have as many educational programs like this, because we can do deals all day long, but if 2 years later everybody's looking back and regretting the transactions, then we haven't served our stakeholders, we haven't served our investors, and we've just created a bunch of paper and disputes for the courts. So we got to get those numbers down. And I wish I had a magic wand solution for it, but be aware that, if you're sitting on a transaction right now and it's 2 years later and it really hasn't been all that for you, you're not alone. It's literally as high as 60 to 70%.
Yeah, no, a great point. I think that was a really good point to end off the formal part of the presentation, where as a buyer, you can't possibly erase all potential risk. Like, you can't do a deal without incurring some risk. It's just, finding very fair ways to try to mitigate that risk, and really assessing the probability of the outcome of that risk, right? So.
And also, there might be a disconnect between what the seller thinks is most valuable that you should be overpaying for and the real reason you're buying the company. And part of the negotiation process is bridging that disconnect and making sure that you're getting what you need from the deal, so that you're mitigating post-closing integration challenges and mitigating post-closing disputes, because the other stuff is fluff, but you got that one thing that you really needed out of the deal. And now it's in your hands, and you can sprinkle your magic fairy dust on it to make it more valuable, like Microsoft did when they bought LinkedIn. I mean, everyone thought they were crazy when they paid $26 billion, but now it's an asset, I think, on books, at least worth over 100 billion or more.
Awesome. Hey, we haven't gotten to any questions. I did get one question this morning by email, so I'm going to try to cover it.
Fire away.
Force majeures. Let's talk about that, the importance of those in agreements. Probably maybe too big of a question to
Let's
knock
put it
off
this
in
way.
half a minute.
If force majeure was a young lady at a middle school dance. She would be the most popular person asked to dance. Force majeure between geopolitical risk, pandemic risk, volatile capital market conditions, supply chain risk, inflation, interest rate risk. I mean, if you don't know the force majeure clause and how it's evolving, you get familiar with it. It is a very hot topic. I mean, even little things like, you know, what is an act of God? Was the pandemic an act of God, an act of Mother Nature? You know, I've never seen so much activity and carve outs and explanations around the force majeure clause. It's typically looked at least 3, 4, 5 years ago as just another piece of legal boilerplate, but it is absolutely one of the most popular young ladies at the dance right now. And
Okay.
everybody wants to take her out for a spin, and everybody wants to negotiate it and talk about it. It is, if it were a hit record song, it's number one with a bullet.
Yeah, for
And that's
sure.
the world
Okay.
we're living in. It's the
Yeah.
world, you know, I don't even know if force majeure does it anymore. We probably need new phraseology and new terms to address the volatile environment that we're in. But you know what? That's what makes this fun. We're all on this webinar because we want to be better advisors to M&A, and things keep evolving. If it got dry, if it got static, it would get boring. And
Yeah.
I don't think any of us want to be bored.
No, and it's definitely not boring in today's dynamic environment.
Sorry,
for
it's
sure.
probably a little too animated for an M&A lawyer, but I hope everybody is okay with it.
Yeah, no, that was great. And for the person that asked me the question on force majeures, I just put Andrew's email in there again. Just reach out to Andrew. I'm sure he'll be able to give you a little bit more color and insight into it. Guys, everybody that's attended this workshop, I'm extremely grateful and humbled that you took the hour to join us. Andrew, I love talking to you, man. We got to do, there's probably like 5 other topics that came out of this that we'll find an opportunity to maybe touch on 1 or 2 of those. For everybody else, apologize for going over time a little bit, but this was a really great presentation. We'll send out the presentation and we'll send out a copy of the recording to everybody. So Andrew, thanks again. Everybody have an awesome day.
Stay safe, everyone.